The village of St. Mary Mead lay quietly beneath a pale autumn sky, its tiled rooftops glistening after a soft drizzle that had washed the dust from the lanes. To the casual visitor, it was the very image of English tranquility: clipped hedgerows, rose trellises still stubbornly in bloom, and the reassuring chime of St. Mary's Church bell marking the hour. Yet, as Jane Marple often reflected from the comfortable perch of her window, peace in a village was rarely more than a surface veneer. Beneath the polite greetings and well-swept steps lurked secrets, small envies, and the occasional very grave matter indeed. It was on a Tuesday morning, whilst she sat with her knitting in hand, that news came which startled the entire parish. Inspector Slack retired. These last few years from official duty had been found dead. The announcement was brought with a great deal of relish by Mr. Caleb Carter, the village postman, who knocked on Miss Marple's door with a face redder than the autumn berries in his satchel. Terrible business. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack dead as anything. Found this morning in his study at the cottage. Dr. Haydock says sudden. But I heard Sergeant Fletcher mutter it weren't natural. Miss Marple looked up from her needles with mild blue eyes, though inwardly she felt a quiet prickle of curiosity. Inspector Slack had been, during his service, a figure both respected and resented. Brisk, often brusque, and not without a streak of conceit. He had clashed more than once with her own gentle interventions in village affairs. Indeed, she said, her voice calm, Inspector Slack, gone. One cannot help but feel a certain inevitability. He was never the most popular of men. As word spread, the villagers gathered small clusters of speculation outside the grocer's, and in the pews of St. Mary's. Some suggested heart failure, others hinted at darker causes, for though Slack was retired, he had continued to praticate notes on petty squabbles, threatening letters about minor misdemeanors, and, it was said, writing some memoirs of his cases. More than one resident had reason to feel uneasy about what those memoirs might contain. By afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Sergeant Fletcher himself, a man she considered well-meaning, but easily flustered. He stood awkwardly in her parlour, twisting his cap in his hands. "It's delicate, ma'am. The inspector's gone, right enough. Found in his chair at 7:30. Cup of tea beside him. Only thing is the doctor found traces of digitalis. Poison. That's why I thought, well, you've an eye for these matters, Miss Marple." She regarded him gently, her knitting still in hand. "Digitalis, you say? How curious. Such an old-fashioned remedy, and one easily overadmitted. But one imagines Inspector Slack was not the sort to take medicine lightly, unless prescribed." Fletcher shifted. "That's just it. He weren't under any treatment, so it stands to reason someone slipped it to him." The suspects, as they came to be whispered about, were quickly apparent to Miss Marple's discerning mind. There was Mrs. Clara Slack, his long-suffering wife, a woman of delicate nerves, who had borne his domineering ways with tight-lipped endurance. Then Major Leonard Drury, a retired officer whose run-in with Slack over a wartime procurement scandal still left bitter echoes. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, proprietress of the village tea-shop, had once been publicly humiliated by Slack during a licensing dispute. Young Peter Copley, the curate's nephew, had lately been seen leaving Slack's cottage under rather mysterious circumstances. And lastly, Dr. Haydock himself, for though he was a man of integrity, professional pride sometimes led to unexpected quarrels. The inquest was set for the week's end, but already the village hummed like a disturbed hive. Miss Marple, from her vantage point of delicate observation, felt certain that the matter would not be so simply concluded, for death by poison is rarely accidental, and never entirely without purpose. The rain cleared by morning, leaving the hedgerows dripping like lace, and Miss Marple decided to pay a neighbourly call on Mrs. Slack. The widow received her in a parlour that smelt faintly of camphor and stale tobacco. She was pale, her hands worrying a lace handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple, I can't take it in. Slack, gone like that. He was writing only the night before his wretched notes. You know, always scribbling. Said he was going to set the record straight about the old cases. I told him he'd only stir up trouble." Miss Marple offered gentle condolences, yet filed the detail away. Memoirs, she thought, that would certainly give rise to apprehension in some quarters. Later that day, she encountered Major Drury at the High Street tobacconist's. His moustache bristled, his tone loud enough for passers-by. Good riddance, some might say. Slack was always poking where not wanted. Dashed, impertinent fellow. If you ask me, he made more enemies than friends. He caught Miss Marple's eye and coloured. "Beg pardon, madam. A death's a death, but one can't ignore the man's manner." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting bag over her arm. "Indeed, Major, it is often not the great deeds, but the small discourtesies, that are remembered longest." At the tea shop, Mrs. Simmons poured her visitor a cup with a trembling hand. "It's been ghastly, Miss Marple. People whispering that I had reason to despise him. Well, I did. He nearly had my license revoked over a mere misunderstanding with the wine merchant. But kill him? Never. I only wish him to stop hounding me." Miss Marple noted the agitation, the quick glance toward the back room. A young delivery boy slipped out, avoiding her eye. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting. The most intriguing conversation occurred that evening when she encountered young Peter Copley near the vicarage. The boy flushed scarlet when she mentioned Inspector Slack. "I hardly knew him, Miss Marple. Only went to deliver a parcel once or twice. That's all." Yet his manner was evasive, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. She wondered what parcel had been so important. By week's end, Miss Marple had gathered threads enough to sense the weave of a pattern, though its final image was not yet clear. Slack had threatened, bullied, and exposed more than one villager. The poison had come in tea, that much was sure, but whose hand had poured it, and whose motive strongest, remained the puzzle. At the inquest, Dr. Haydock testified gravely. Traces of digitalis in the stomach, sufficient to induce heart failure, not self-administered. The coroner recorded a verdict of death by poisoning, administered by person or persons unknown. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Suspicion swirled thicker than the autumn fog. Major Drury was overheard muttering about, having been questioned at length by the police. Mrs. Simmons wept in her shop, declaring herself ruined by gossip. Young Peter Copley disappeared for 2 days entirely, said to have gone up to London, and Mrs. Slack, draped in black, kept to her rooms, receiving no visitors. Miss Marple, meanwhile, studied the small details others overlooked. She remembered the postman's early remark about Slack's cup of tea. Who had brewed it? Mrs. Slack insisted she had gone to bed early, leaving her husband alone with his papers. Could the inspector have accepted refreshment from another source? One evening, riffling through her knitting basket, Miss Marple recalled an old case involving digitalis, a widow who had saved tablets to be slipped, years later, into her second husband's port. Such things were rarely wasted. Where, in the village, she mused, was there ready access to the drug? The answer, of course, lay with Dr. Haydock's surgery. Yet surely he was above suspicion, unless someone had stolen it. A curious twist arose when Sergeant Fletcher confided to her that Slack's papers had gone missing. All those notes, gone from the desk drawer. Someone broke in after, or maybe before. That's why we're stumped, Miss Marple. Without them, no telling who he might have been writing about. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. That, Sergeant, may be the very key. Someone feared exposure, and so silenced him. Still, she felt unease. Each suspect bore motive, yet the opportunity remained elusive, until, at last, a chance remark at the grocer's shed light. Mrs. Simmons, complaining of her delivery boy's unreliability, mentioned Slack used to have him carry little parcels back and forth. "Books," he said. "Research for his writing." Miss Marple's needles paused mid books, or something else entirely. That evening, Miss Marple invited Sergeant Fletcher for tea. She set before him a modest tray of scones, and, while he buttered them clumsily, outlined her theory. "The truth, Sergeant, is not to be found in what was taken, but in what was left." Inspector Slack's notes vanished, but his teacup remained. And in that cup, someone wished to end his life quickly, before he could reveal inconvenient facts. Fletcher frowned. "But who, ma'am?" "They all had cause." "Precisely. Yet, cause alone is not enough. One must consider character. Mrs. Slack endured much, but she is timid, and would sooner bear humiliation than risk scandal. Major Drury blusters, but he is no poisoner. His pride would demand open confrontation. Dr. Haydock had access to digitalis, but no wish to use it. Mrs. Simmons feared ruin, yes, but lacks opportunity. The curate's nephew, however young Peter, had the means to enter the cottage, under guise of delivering parcels, and he is of an age where youthful desperation might prompt reckless deeds. Fletcher gaped. But why him? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because the parcel contained more than books. Slack had discovered his involvement in a theft from his employer in London's small sums, perhaps, but enough to disgrace the vicar's family. Slack intended to expose him in those memoirs, The boy, in terror, took drastic action. The sergeant shifted uneasily. "You've no proof, though." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Proof, Sergeant, is often found when one knows precisely where to look. In the tea leaves, as it were." The denouement came, fittingly, in the vicarage study. Miss Marple requested the presence of all concerned. Mrs. Slack, pale and fluttering. Major Drury, stiff with indignation. Mrs. Simmons, wringing her hands. Dr. Haydock, grave, and young Peter, summoned with some difficulty by his uncle. Sergeant Fletcher presided nervously. Miss Marple, her knitting on her lap, spoke with quiet authority. Inspector Slack was poisoned by digitalis in his evening tea. At first, suspicion might fall on his wife, or his old adversaries, but one must ask who had both opportunity to serve that tea, and strongest reason to prevent his memoirs from seeing daylight. Only one among us fits the bill. Her eyes settled on Peter. The boy flushed crimson, then white. "No, I didn't mean it wasn't supposed to," Miss Marple continued gently. "Slack had evidence of your misappropriations in London. He threatened to expose you. You brought parcels to his cottage often, under the guise of books. And that evening you slipped into the kitchen, brewed his tea, and added the fatal drops. Later, you removed his notes to conceal the trail. But you overlooked one small thing. Mrs. Slack heard the kettle boil after she retired, though she said nothing at the time. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the vicar's clock. At last, Peter buried his face in his hands. I only wanted to stop him. He said he'd ruin us all." There was a murmur of pity, even from Mrs. Simmons. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Fear can drive one to dreadful folly, but truth will out, always." Slack himself would have said so. Sergeant Fletcher, though shaken, took the boy into custody. The others departed, each subdued by the turn of events. As the vicarage door closed, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose. She looked into the fire with quiet reflection. Inspector Slack, for all his faults, had died as he lived, causing disturbance, yet in the end, the village returned, as villagers always did, to its gentle rhythm of bells and gossip, and teacopes. Miss Marple walked home beneath the starlit sky. Her step unhurried, her heart steady. She had seen again how the smallest observation a kettle boiled, a hand trembled, a word misplaced could unravel the darkest knot. And in St. Mary Mead, peace was restored until the next time fate, with a certain mischievous hand, chose to intervene. Evening had fallen over St. Mary Mead, and the mist rose like a pale veil from the meadows beyond the churchyard. The lamps in the cottages glowed warmly against the encroaching dusk, but in Miss Marple's mind there was little warmth. Her needles clicked steadily, her hands moving almost by instinct, while her mind pursued its quiet analysis of Inspector Slack's death. Every scrap of gossip, every nervous glance, every misplaced word now arranged itself into a pattern. Where others saw only confusion, she saw the faint threads drawing together. What troubled her most was not the inspector's death itself, but the vanished papers. Slack had been an inveterate note-taker, a man who hoarded facts the way others collected stamps. For his notes to vanish entirely meant one thing only. Someone feared their contents deeply enough to risk theft on the very night of murder. Miss Marple's parlour, with its faded chintz and faint scent of lavender, had been the scene of many village teas and confidences. That night it became, in its unassuming way, the crucible of truth. She had invited Sergeant Fletcher for a quiet cup, knowing the young man was more candid in her presence than in the stiff atmosphere of the pest station. Fletcher sat awkwardly on the edge of her armchair, his cap in his lap, while Miss Marple poured the tea with unhurried precision. "I've been thinking, Sergeant," she said, passing him the sugar tongs. "So often, you know, the most telling evidence is not what one finds, but what is missing." He frowned, stirring his cup. "You mean the notes, ma'am?" "Yes, that's got us baffled. Whoever killed Slack must have taken them, but it could have been any of them. They all had something to hide." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "Quite, yet consider Inspector Slack was found with a cup of tea. Not brandy, nor cocoa, but tea. His wife insists she retired early, which means he either made it himself, a most unlikely act for so fussy a man, or accepted it from another." Fletcher looked up sharply. "You think someone came round that night, my dear Sergeant?" "It seems almost certain. The question is, who would he have admitted willingly? Not Major Drury, who would have shouted him down. Not Mrs. Simmons, who he would rather lecture than entertain. Not Dr. Haydock. Slack mistrusted doctors, as you know. and his wife has made it plain she was upstairs. That leaves only one other young Peter Copley. The sergeant blinked. The curate's nephew, but he's just a lad. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Youth, sergeant, is no protection against folly. He had reason to call, as he had been carrying parcels for Slack. He could have come under that pretense, brewed the tea, and added the fatal drops, and he had reason to fear Slack's pen more than anyone. Fletcher's brow furrowed. Reason. I can't see what the boy's done. Miss Marple set down her cup, her needles clicking once more. Have you never wondered why a promising young man, said to be working in a London office, has suddenly removed himself to the vicarage? His uncle spoke of resting nerves, but I recall such euphemisms. The truth is simpler. The boy was dismissed for pilfering small sums. Inspector Slack discovered the matter he was in contact with. Certain constables in London still and threatened to expose it in his memoirs. For a lad so closely tied to the vicarage, such disgrace would have been intolerable. The sergeant let out a low whistle. By Jove, if that's true, he had the strongest motive of the lot. Indeed, said Miss Marple calmly, the strongest motive, and the simplest means. Slack was meticulous about his tea. He would only drink it freshly brewed. So when the kettle boiled again, after Mrs. Slack retired, it could not have been for himself. It was for a guest. Silence hung for a moment, broken only by the faint tick of the mantel clock. Fletcher leaned forward. Then what do we do, ma'am? Confront him. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Not yet. One must be certain before making such an accusation. But I believe the proof lies in the missing papers. They were not destroyed in haste. They were hidden, and a frightened boy seldom hides things far from hand. If you search the vicarage lodgings, discreetly, I think you may find them. The sergeant nodded, determination flickering in his features. But Miss Marple, who knew more of human nature than procedure, merely folded her knitting and laid it in her lap. She thought of Peter, pale, nervous, avoiding her gaze. Fear, in the young, was combustible. One sharp spark from Slack's threats had been enough to ignite it into desperate action. Yet, she mused, there was still the faintest chance he might admit his guilt without ruinous exposure. A village, after all, could be merciless in its gossip, but also unexpectedly forgiving when guided by a steady hand. The next day, Fletcher returned, his face grave. In Peter's chest of drawers, beneath a stack of shirts, had been found a bundle of note slacks, scrawled papers, annotated with names, dates, and petty scandals, proof enough, and damning. Miss Marple listened without triumph. Poor child, she murmured, driven to ruin by his own folly, and by Slack's unkind zeal. Well, sergeant, I believe the time has come to gather all concerned, and let the truth be spoken. Secrets fester, you know, unless brought to light. And so it was arranged, a meeting at the vicarage study. Not a courtroom, nor a police station, but a place where the guilty might be faced by the eyes of those most affected. For Miss Marple knew that revelation, in such cases, required not only fact, but the stern presence of community. That evening, as she walked home under the quiet stars, Miss Marple felt again the familiar mix of sorrow and inevitability. Slack had lived a life of interference, and in the end, it had undone him. Yet justice, though slow and quiet as her own knitting needles, was inexorable. The pattern was complete now, only waiting to be shown. The vicarage study had never before hosted such an assembly. Its oak-panelled walls and sombre shelves of theological tomes bore witness now. Two faces tense with expectation, curiosity, and dread. A fire crackled in the grate, though the evening was mild, and the heavy curtains were drawn against the village night. At Miss Marple's quiet request, Sergeant Fletcher had gathered the principal figures connected to Inspector Slack's death. Mrs. Slack sat stiffly in black bomber, her lace handkerchief fluttering with each nervous movement. Major Drury stood erect, mustache bristling, one hand resting on his silver-topped cane. Mrs. Simmons fidgeted on the edge of her chair, her eyes darting toward the door as if she longed to escape back to the safety of her tea-shop. Dr. Haydock leaned against the mantelpiece, arms folded, his expression grave, and young Peter Copley, pale and drawn, sat in a corner seat, his uncle the vicar beside him, a hand of quiet restraint upon his sleeve. Miss Marple herself, knitting in her lap, looked the very picture of benign gentility. To an untrained eye she might have seemed merely an elderly spinster called in to lend moral support. Yet to those who knew her, the faint gleam in her blue eyes and the deliberate calm of her manner spoke volumes. "My friends," she began softly, We are gathered here because a very grave act has disturbed the peace of St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack, though not universally beloved, was a man of order and of duty. His sudden death has left unanswered questions which, if not faced honestly, will leave a shadow upon us all. Mrs. Slack dabbed her eyes. I can't bear it. Miss Marple talk of poison and such things. Slack was difficult, yes, but he didn't deserve. Her voice broke. No one deserves murder, my dear, said Miss Marple kindly. Yet murder there has been, and though each of us might prefer silence, truth has a way of insisting upon itself. She glanced at Fletcher, who shifted uneasily, then turned her gaze to the group. Inspector Slack was poisoned with digitalis in his tea. We must ask, who had both reason to wish him gone and the opportunity to prepare that fatal cup? Major Drury cleared his throat with a snort. If you're implying me, madame, let me say at once I may have had cause to dislike the fellow, but I'd never stooped to womanish trickery with poisons. If I'd wanted Slack gone, I'd have told him to his face. Precisely, Major, said Miss Marple serenely. Your character is not one to resort to subterfuge. And Mrs. Simmons, she turned gently to the tea-shop owner, who flushed crimson. You feared Inspector Slack's constant interference, but you had no access to digitalis, nor the nerve for such a crime. Mrs. Simmons let out a shaky breath, as if absolved by the words. Dr. Haydock, too, though he possessed the means, had no motive. Indeed, his reputation depends upon saving life, not taking it. And Mrs. Slack, her eyes softened on the widow. You had endured much, but I do not believe you capable of so dreadful an act against your own husband. However trying he may have been. Mrs. Slack gave a weak sob and shook her head. Miss Marple paused, her needles clicking once or twice before she set them aside. Her eyes rested on the last figure, young Peter, whose face was now white as parchment. There remains one among us, she said gently, who had both the opportunity to bring that tea and the strongest motive of all, fear. Fear not of insult or inconvenience, but of ruin. Peter Copley. Inspector Slack had discovered your dismissal from your London post. He knew of the sums taken, the petty thefts covered by silence, and he intended to include them in his memoirs. You saw your uncle's good name endangered, your own life disgraced, and so, in desperation, you brewed a cup of tea laced with digitalis, and placed it before him. The words hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. Peter leapt to his feet, his eyes wild. No, I didn't, I never, but his voice faltered under the weight of every gaze in the room. He said he'd destroy me. He said he'd send word to the papers, to my employers. I couldn't let him. The vicar rose, deeply shaken. Peter, my boy. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost sorrowful. In your panic, you thought only of escape. You took his notes as well, thinking to silence him forever. But such acts cannot remain hidden. Mrs. Slack heard the kettle boil again that night, though she kept silent, not wishing to believe what she knew. And Sergeant Fletcher has found those notes concealed in your drawer. Peter sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. I only wanted him to stop. I didn't mean I didn't think the room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Even Major Drury looked grim rather than triumphant. Mrs. Simmons dabbed her eyes, while Mrs. Slack stared at her folded hands. Dr. Haydock spoke at last, his voice measured. It is a tragedy, yes, but not a mystery any longer. The law must take its course. Sergeant Fletcher stepped forward, reluctant but resolute. Peter Copley, I'm afraid I must place you under arrest. The boy made no protest. The vicar bowed his head, a broken figure beside him. When the others had departed, subdued and silent, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the fire. The study was hushed, the air heavy with sorrow. Fletcher stood uncertainly at her side. You've done it again, ma'am, he said softly. Saw through the whole lot of it. I'd never have guessed the lad. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on the flames. It is often the young sergeant, who in their fear and folly commit acts more desperate than hardened men. One must never underestimate desperation, nor, for that matter, the significance of a boiling kettle. Later, as she walked home along the quiet lane, the stars above glimmered faintly through the mist. The village seemed once again at peace, the cottages dark, save for the occasional lamp. Yet Miss Marple knew too well that peace in a village was never more than provisional. Life, with its jealousies, its frailties, and its secrets, would always provide the next disturbance. Still, she reflected, St. Mary Mead would endure. There would be more church fêtes, more flower shows, more gossip over teacups, and she, with her needles and her sharp eyes, would always be there to see what others overlooked. For, in the end, human nature was as patterned as her knitting knot's flaws, and all end just as surely unraveled by those who knew how to read it, and thus the case of Inspector Slack's death came to its close, leaving behind not triumph, but a quiet, inevitable justice. The days that followed the revelation at the vicarage were marked by a curious stillness in St. Mary Mead, the sort of hush that settles after a storm has passed. The village went on. Of course it always did, but with a subdued air, as though every inhabitant were reluctant to speak too loudly, lest their words stir up more ghosts than they could manage. News of Peter Copley's arrest travelled swiftly, carried in whispers along the high street, murmured over counters at the grocer's, and breathed with fascinated pity across the pews on Sunday. Yet, unlike the lurid scandals that sometimes seize a village and run riot, this story held its listeners in a gentler, more thoughtful silence. The boy was young, after all. His crime terrible, yes, but born of panic and fear rather than malice. It was, in a sense, an act too understandable for anyone to indulge in shrill condemnation. Miss Marple, seated in her familiar parlour, with the autumn light streaming in through the lace curtains, reflected that the village response itself was proof of one of her long-held beliefs, that people are rarely as simple as they seem. A thief might be kind-hearted, a gossip might also be the truest friend, and even a murderer might have in him not cruelty but a desperate yearning to escape his own weakness. Inspector Slack, she mused, had been a man of certainties, self-assured, often blind to the subtleties of motive. He would not, perhaps, have appreciated the irony that his own demise had been caused, not by an avowed enemy, but by a frightened boy. And yet, Miss Marple thought, was that not always the way? One expects great villains, and one finds only small tragedies writ large at the tea-shop. Mrs. Simmons quietly removed the inspector's favourite seat by the window, as though by rearranging her chairs she could erase the shadow of his presence. She served her customers with unusual solemnity for a fortnight before gradually returning to her chatty, bustling self. Major Drury continued to declaim against Slack's methods, though his tone grew softer. He took to speaking of the inspector with a grudging respect he would never have shown in life. Mrs. Slack, for her part, entered into a new phase of existence. At first, she was seen only in mourning weeds, shuffling to church with downcast eyes, but soon she began to move about the village more freely, her shoulders a little straighter, her conversation less tremulous. To some, it seemed indecent, far too soon for cheerfulness, considering, but Miss Marple, who understood such matters, recognized the truth. Mrs. Slack had been released from a lifetime of domination. Widowhood, though marked by tragedy, had brought her a measure of peace. As for the vicarage, the scandal hung more heavily there than anywhere. The vicar, a good man, bore it with resignation, though the lines in his face deepened as he preached of forgiveness. Parishioners looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort, as though his nephew's crime cast some mysterious shadow upon his own pulpit. Yet, in time, even that would fade. St. Mary Mead had seen worse. After all, villagers, Miss Marple knew, had long memories for gossip but short endurance for outrage. For Miss Marple herself, the affair was another thread in the long tapestry of her observations about human nature. She never thought of her successes in terms of triumph. Indeed, she disliked the very word. Solving crimes was, to her mind, less about outwitting others than about recognizing familiar patterns. As she resumed her knitting in the weeks after, she considered the parallels. A girl once poisoned her stepmother's cat for fear of discovery over a broken heirloom. A young footman in a neighbouring parish had stolen from his employer's pantry because he dreaded admitting to his gambling losses. Fear, pride, shame, those were the true engines of human behaviour. Slack himself had not understood that. He collected facts, harshly, as one collects specimens, dead things pinned to a board. He lacked sympathy, and thus lacked perception. Miss Marple, with her lifetime of village acquaintance, knew that one must observe with kindness if one wished to understand. People reveal themselves, not when they are interrogated, but when they are allowed to speak of trifles, ailments, the price of tea. It amused her, sometimes, that others mistook her endless curiosity for idle prattle. In truth, it was her library, the record of small gestures and murmured confidences that, in the right moment, explained a murder as clearly as any fingerprint. One evening, Sergeant Fletcher called again at Miss Marple's cottage. He looked weary, older than his years, the burden of the case lingering upon him. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said awkwardly, standing with cap in hand. "It's never easy, bringing in a lad, harder than a hardened criminal, in some ways. But you showed us the truth." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "The truth, Sergeant, is often very simple once one sets aside the noise. It is only human nature, repeating itself in endless variety. I merely recognized the pattern." Fletcher shifted, troubled. Do you think the village will ever be the same again?" She considered, her needles pausing midst. "The village will always be the same, Sergeant, because human beings will always be the same. There will be more fates, more quarrels, more secrets, and, alas, more tragedies. But each will pass, and St. Mary Mead will remain, just as it always has." He nodded slowly, as though drawing comfort from her certainty. For those who looked from the outside, the case of Inspector Slack's death might have seemed a small affair, hardly worth the notice of London newspapers. A retired policeman poisoned in a sleepy village, hardly the stuff of great headlines. Yet Miss Marple knew better. In the quiet heart of such stories lay truths larger than any sensational crime. She thought of the boy Peter, his life blighted not only by his crime but by the fear that had led to it. Had someone shown him kindness? Had someone offered understanding rather than condemnation? Might he have found the courage to face his mistakes without resorting to murder? Perhaps, but human nature, she knew, rarely turned aside from its chosen path. Once fear took root, it grew swiftly, choking out reason. That was the lesson Miss Marple carried forward, and one she hoped others might heed, that behind every crime lies not only malice but weakness unaddressed, unnoticed, or to watch over one's neighbor, to listen with patience, to extend a hand at the right moments. Such things might prevent tragedies before they ever flowered. As autumn deepened into winter, Miss Marple's garden shed its final roses. She sat by her fire, knitting needles flashing, while the mantel clock ticked steadily. Outside, the lane lay quiet, dusted with frost. She thought again of Inspector Slack, of his notes filled with petty triumphs and grievances. He had sought to write his legacy in ink, to assert himself upon history. Instead, his true legacy lay in the cautionary tale of his death, a reminder that authority without kindness breeds resentment, and that fear, when pressed too hard, will find its outlet in violence. She sighed softly, not with sorrow but with acceptance. Human nature was unchanging, and she, in her quiet way, would go on watching, understanding, and, when called upon, unraveling. And so, the affair of Inspector Slack's death passed into memory, leaving the village to its routines once more. Yet for those who listened, who observed, who reflected, the story bore a lesson worth carrying beyond St. Mary Mead. It is easy, in life, to dismiss small failings, to scold without understanding, to enforce rules without compassion, but such acts repeated, wear upon the soul of those who receive them. Fear festers where kindness is absent, and shame grows in the dark. Miss Marple would never have put it in grand terms, but the truth was plain to her. The smallest gesture of gentleness, the quietest word of encouragement, might turn the course of a life, and just as surely, the lack of such kindness might drive a soul to desperate ruin. As listeners, perhaps we too may take from this quiet village tale a measure of guidance. Let us not wait until fear drives others to despair. Let us notice, as Miss Marple notices, the tremor in a hand, the hesitation in a voice, the burden carried silently, for it is in the smallest acts, listening, understanding, forgiving, that we guard not only against crime, but against tragedy, and perhaps, in that, we do more to preserve the peace of our own villages, whether they be lanes in the English countryside, or streets in the modern world, than all the Inspectors Slack who ever lived.